We have some pretty substantial NHL news. We have over 100 players on the waiver wire today who could be claimed to be changing teams. We could have significant player movement. We'll discuss who's on waivers coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, normally we don't do a dedicated video talking just about the waiver wire. We usually include it in another news or rumor type video, but today there's so many players on waivers, I decided we needed to do our own special dedicated video because there's over 100 players on waivers. Of course, as we know, it's quite common to see a heavy amount of players go through the waiver wire on the near the end of training camps as teams are getting closer to setting their roster. Of course, training camps are usually a little bit longer, they have more time, and this is usually a process that's a little bit more drawn out. The other thing with this is teams are up against the cap more, so they need to bury more players in the minors, which is obviously part of this too. And they're able to put players on the taxi squad this year and carry an expanded roster because of the unique season. And that again is a factor. So of course, opening day rosters are due by 5 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow, so teams need to have their rosters ready and be cap compliant. So of course today is kind of like your cutoff if you needed to send players down to the minors as part of this process to be cap compliant for opening day. So we're going to go through the long list of players here, talk about which ones are more likely to be claimed. There's some pretty significant players on here actually, so somewhat surprising. Some pretty good veterans on some decent contracts, so be interesting to see if we have a lot of movement. Now, before we jump into today's players, we did have one claim from yesterday. The Montreal Canadiens have lost young defenseman Noah Jewelson, who was claimed off the waiver wire by the Florida Panthers. Of course, we know Jewelson suffered a pretty significant eye injury a while back and has been trying to battle back and find an NHL job and just hasn't really been able to get himself to the point with Montreal that he's been able to crack a number 6, number 7 spot and stick in the NHL. Of course, we saw them even make more additions to their blue line this year, and a guy like Romanov coming over is just going to bump him a little further down. So obviously it's not a surprise he went on waivers, and a team like Florida is not surprising to see them try to add some more depth as well after they moved out a lot of defensemen during the past offseason. So let's go through this list of players here. You may see me looking down a little bit from time to time just because I can't remember 100 players like that off the top of my head. I don't have a teleprompter or anything like that, so just bear with me here. I will throw up some graphics as we go through this as well, just to kind of help you follow along since there's so many names. The graphics that I'm going to show you are courtesy of Puck Report NHL on Twitter, so I do thank them for putting these out and putting them out on Twitter because it's a big help when you're trying to look through the list here and kind of whittle things down. So let's get started with the Canadian teams, which is a lot of really interesting players here. The Habs have a couple of interesting forwards. They just signed a one-year deals, and it's Corey Perry and Michael Frolik, both on waivers today. Of course, after losing Noah Jewelson, a lot of Habs reporters felt that it was going to come down to probably Corey Perry or Victor Mete to make that final roster spot. And after losing Jewelson, they don't want to take the chance to lose Mete. So unfortunately, Perry's on there as well. So Frolik we thought was more of a guarantee, and so they're at risk to lose both these guys. I mean, I would think Perry's more likely to be claimed than Frolik, but I guess you just never know. Of course, teams are obviously looking to swap players, so they might be able to bury somebody in the minors but take somebody on with a cheaper contract. So I really think there's a high probability to see more claims than usual for sure, especially given the vast amount of players. But that's some interesting moves by Bergevin and the Habs. I know we've had a lot of praise for Perry. Wants to use him on the net front presence on the power play. So I think they're kind of crossing their fingers here that another team doesn't take him. We know Corey Perry was a Habs fan growing up too, and I think he was quite happy to go and sign in Montreal. So I think all parties involved will be relatively upset and disappointed if he does indeed get claimed by another NHL franchise. But we won't know the answer to that until noon Eastern time tomorrow. Now, when it comes to some of the other Canadian cities, we're looking at the Edmonton Oilers, for example. They got goaltender Anton Forsberg, forward Jujhar Khaira. Also have Nygaard on waivers as well, so nothing too shocking there out of Edmonton, but guys like Khaira and Nygaard are decent depth forwards. I could certainly see the possibility of a claim happening there. In their rival in Calgary, they certainly have some interesting guys as well. You got forward and centerman Derek Ryan, who's a bit of a surprise. He's on waivers. You've got young defenseman Oliver Shillington. I think there's probably good odds he gets taken. I mean, he's a pretty interesting young defenseman looking for more opportunity. I'm a little surprised that he's on waivers here as well. And they also have forward Zach Ronaldo. Well, he's not much of a surprise. I figured he'd most likely spend the season between the taxi squad and the AHL. Now, when it comes to the Ottawa Senators, they just sent down Max Lajoie after he cleared waivers yesterday. Another defenseman in Christian Yaros. Some interesting young forwards, though, like Philip Schlappick and Rudy Balcers. Some interesting guys there. JC Beaudin, who's had off and on time on the fourth line over the past year or so. But obviously with a lot of the guys they brought in through the offseason and younger recent draft players they want to give more opportunity to, I can see him kind of getting pushed out of the lineup there. Also got some depth forwards as well, like a Matthew Pekka, Logan Shaw, and Michael Haley. So, difficult to say. You can see maybe a guy like Pekka who could be an interesting option for some teams out there as well. The Maple Leafs have some players on waivers as well. They've already cleared a few guys previously here in the past few days without losing anybody, but they now have to put through Calle Rosen, Marty Marinson, and forwards Travis Boyd, Adam Brooks, and Kenny D'Agostino. So some interesting choices there too, really. I mean, I know there was some talk of guys like Boyd or Brooks might have the opportunity to maybe make the club, but obviously some of these moves are based on cap situations. Some of them are made just on roster spots and who earned them more, I guess. But in the case of Toronto, they also had sent down Joey Anderson, who was previously acquired, another depth forward. We know the Leafs have all kinds of forwards, and they're likely bound to have a decently strong Marlies team here yet again this year, based on all the amount of players they can send down there. Obviously, Pierre Engvall's another guy, doesn't need waivers, but another guy that the Maple Leafs cut here as well. The Vancouver Canucks have some big names on waivers, and unfortunately for them, I don't think they're going to be a too big of a risk to lose them, but I know they'd love to, and that's a guy like Louis Eriksson on waivers again, Sven Baertschi, and then Justin Bailey. Now, Bailey I can see maybe being on the taxi squad. I'm not quite sure what their plans are for him. Same thing goes for Baertschi, but I would think that given the contracts that Baertschi and Eriksson are less likely to be claimed by other teams, but again, cap-driven decisions made here by Vancouver. They need to get cap compliant, and obviously bearing some contracts will save them some cap space. So that's some pretty big players there as well. I'm sure, like I said, the Vancouver Canucks would love somebody to take Eriksson off their hands. I unfortunately just don't see it happening. If anybody's going to take him, they're going to want him plus something extra for doing them the favor. So we'll see what the Canucks end up with, but my guess is that they probably all clear in the case of those guys. Now, the last Canadian team to touch on here is the Winnipeg Jets, and they've got a pretty solid forward out there too, like Matthew Perreault. I mean, Perreault's a longtime NHL veteran. For the most part, generally a third-line guy, can still give you, maybe 15 goals, play decently two-way game, like still a solid player. You got Lucas Spiza, veteran depth defenseman. You got goaltender Eric Comrie. Not a huge shock he's on waivers. Of course, he's expected to likely be their number 3 goalie. So, again, there could be more movement out of Winnipeg. And the other thing, too, is like with these players on waivers, these teams know that they're either going to be claimed and they're going to be taken off their hands, or they're going to clear and at the very least be buried in the minors, so they already have a better projection of what their cap space is going to be. Like, so I said, you could see some cases of maybe a guy like Eriksson, for example, going to the minors along with Baertschi, and they're doing that to become cap compliant, but they might have enough space that they could turn around and grab another guy at league minimum and have another player replace those guys on the main roster at 750K or something to that effect as well. So you're not just going to see, obviously, the teams with more space make claims. You could see teams that are trying to become cap compliant kind of swap out more expensive players for less expensive ones as well. So there could be, like I said, a ton of movement heading into tomorrow at noon Eastern. Now that we've covered the Canadian teams, let's take a look at the rest of the league here. Like I said, this is going to take a while, so let's plow through this here. The Tampa Bay Lightning got some very interesting players on waivers as well. Tyler Johnson and Luke Shen back on waivers. Of course, we saw Johnson on waivers earlier this offseason when they were trying to find a team to take him off their hands to make themselves more cap compliant. I'm a little surprised that they went this route again. Obviously, it looks as though they want to put Johnson on the taxi squad instead of being on the opening night roster. But, with all the other long-term injury reserve contracts they acquired, they seem like they could be cap compliant, but obviously they may have some other kind of moves up their sleeves here. So it'll be interesting to see how Tampa reacts to this. But again, a couple of veterans there on waivers that might be appealing to other teams. I think Johnson's less likely given the contract, but Luke Shen, you just never know. It's possible that another team might snag him after how he played last year. He did have a decent year, won a Stanley Cup with Tampa. The Detroit Red Wings have a relatively young forward, Evgeny Svechnikov, of course, brother to Andrei Svechnikov on waivers. He's been with the Red Wings for some time, often injured, never quite lived up to the hype like his brother has. So again, but still a player that teams might look upon as being a project that might be able to take on. They also have goaltender Calvin Pickard and defenseman Joe Hicketts on waivers as well. The St. Louis Blues have a few players, including forwards Jacob Delarose, Mackenzie McEachern, and defenseman Jake Wallman. Nothing too surprising in that front. And the Blues, also with the amount of space they were able to make as well and cutting the roster down, did formally announce that they signed Mike Hoffman to a 1-year, $4 million contract. So his professional tryout now in St. Louis is officially over, and he's now officially a signed player with St. Louis. Golden Knights have players going through waivers as well, including Dylan Sakura, Nick Holden on defense, which is a little bit of a surprise. You get Oscar Dansk, as well as Thomas Yurko. So, I mean, Holden's the most surprising out of all those 4 players. Obviously, that's a cap-controlled decision there. Obviously, Holden normally, I think, would have been good enough to make the top 6 or 7 defensemen on that team, but they need to free up some space, and that's how they're going to go about doing it, I guess. But clearly, at this point, Holden is a player that I would think would be at risk to be grabbed by another franchise. The Arizona Coyotes have a few players on waivers as well, including youngster Dryden Hunt, who's, again, a little bit of a surprise, and Freddie Gauthier. Now, with Gauthier being on waivers, he was in camp with the Coyotes on a professional tryout. So that tells me that they're in the process of signing him, because to bring him from a tryout to a contract, he would need waivers to be able to clear to go back to the NHL roster. So that's the intention there. So Freddie Gauthier is getting signed by Arizona, assuming he does clear. I would assume it's probably going to be a 2-way contract with league minimum pay at the NHL level, will be my guess. The Flyers have some interesting guys on waivers too, including the big, often injured defenseman Sammy Moran. I know that I've heard comments from Flyers earlier this offseason throughout training camp suggesting they might try to use him as a forward this year, especially given his size and everything and their depth on the blue line. They wanted to maybe see if they could turn him into a big winger. So obviously he's going to need waivers. Not going to cut the roster as is though. Another player who could be a project for a team, but to grab him on waivers for nothing is certainly an interesting project a team could take on. They also have goaltender Alex Lyon on waivers as well. And defenseman Derek Pouliot, who's kind of bounced around now through the NHL, gone through waivers many times. I would think he's unlikely to be claimed. Jersey Devils have a couple of younger players, including forwards Colton White and Nick Merkley on waivers. The New York Islanders have some interesting veterans as well. A guy like Andrew Ladd, not a huge shock there. Thomas Hickey, who they've been trying to find a new home for. Obviously, Ladd and Hickey's contracts would be buried in the minors. They've chosen to keep Leo Komarov, who we talked about has been in the rumor mill recently, so obviously those two guys would be the ones that would be buried onto the taxi squad if they remain unclaimed or possibly traded if they can find a home for them later on. They also have forward AJ Greer and Austin Zarnik is on waivers too for the Islanders, so some interesting roster cuts there. We'll see how they proceed, but obviously some more players that are interesting and could possibly find themselves claimed. The Boston Bruins have a few players on waivers, nothing too surprising there. Defenseman Steven Kampfer, Zach Senyshyn, as well as forward Greg McKegg. So nothing too big there, but some players who could be other depth players on other teams. The Washington Capitals have put through Phoenix Copley and forward Daniel Carr. Now, in the case of Copley, the goaltender going through waivers tells me that maybe they're going to be signing Craig Anderson. He's been in camp on a PTO. Copley's really the only other NHL caliber goaltender, at least in my opinion, that has experience that they could go with. So, I mean, they do have some other younger goalies they could decide to go with, but based on what many people are assuming here, Copley very well could get assigned to the taxi squad or the AHL, and they very well could sign Anderson possibly to a league minimum deal and get themselves a little extra cap space. But they are already cap compliant. They don't have to make any additional moves there. The Carolina Hurricanes have defenseman Joaquin Ryan on waivers. Another guy that's a decent amount of experience. Could go and be a depth player somewhere. And you also have the San Jose Sharks with newly signed defenseman Freddie Claesson. He'll have to clear waivers. So he could possibly be claimed. But again, considering how long it took him to get a contract, pretty unlikely. And they also have forward Antti Suomela as well. So obviously there's a ton of guys on waivers as we just talked about here. Let me know what your thoughts are and who gets claimed. Who do you think could put in a claim? Obviously it's going to go by the order of the standings from last season since the season hasn't started yet. So there's a lot of players out there. Depending on who puts a claim in on what guy will determine where players go. I said yesterday we only had one claim. That's Noel Jewelson, who the Habs lose. And we'll have some very interesting developments here. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And we can discuss further. And of course, we'll do a follow-up tomorrow because I assume there'll be enough of these guys claimed that we'll likely do another dedicated video. If that doesn't happen, I might include it in another new set video as well. But we'll see. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. And we'll catch you next time.